Did you know that the most powerful productivity system ever designed was not created by a Silicon Valley startup, not published in a best-selling business book, and not discovered through years of modern neuroscience research? It was written in private journals by a Roman emperor who never intended anyone to read them. It was practiced in the pre-dawn darkness by a man who had been born a slave and died one of the most quoted philosophers in human history. It was lived daily by a statesman so wealthy he could have spent every morning in luxury and every evening in indulgence, and who chose instead to rise before the household stirred, sit in deliberate stillness, and examine the architecture of his own soul. Sounds like a superpower, right? Well, here is the thing. It is. And unlike almost every other superpower you have ever been promised, this one is completely, immediately, and permanently available to you, starting tomorrow morning. Because what Marcus Aurelius, Epictetus, and Seneca understood, what they built their entire philosophical practice around, is something that modern neuroscience is only now catching up to. How you begin your day determines who you are in it, and how you end your day determines who you become through it. Not the apps you use, not the productivity hacks, not the morning smoothie or the cold plunge or the 5-step evening wind-down protocol that some influencer is selling for $300. The quality of your intentional attention at the beginning and end of each day. That is it. That is the whole game. And in today's world, where most people begin their mornings by handing their mind directly to an algorithm before their eyes have fully opened, and end their evenings staring at a screen until they collapse into sleep having never once examined what the day actually meant. This ancient practice is not just wisdom. It is the most radical act of self-determination available to a human being. So whether you have tried morning routines before and abandoned them, whether your evenings feel like they disappear before you can catch them, or whether you simply sense that there is a more intentional and more powerful way to move through your days, stay with me. What we are building today is not a routine. It is an identity, a daily architecture of the soul. The same structure that allowed some of history's most burdened, most tested, most pressure-filled human beings to show up with clarity, with courage, and with an inner steadiness that the chaos around them simply could not penetrate. And every single brick of it is available to you. If this kind of depth resonates, if you are someone who is genuinely seeking to live more intentionally and more powerfully, subscribe to this channel. It is free. It costs you nothing. And it is the kind of content that compounds in your life the longer you stay. Don't skip ahead. What comes later will reframe everything that comes first. Stay with me all the way through. Did you know that the average person makes approximately 35,000 decisions every single day? 35,000. And most of them, the vast, exhausting, invisible majority, are made not from clarity or intention or conscious choice, but from the mental state you carried into the day without examining it. The mood you woke up inside, the anxiety that was already running before your first cup of coffee, the unresolved tension from yesterday that you carried into sleep and carried back out of it 8 hours later, unchanged, unnamed, and directing your behavior from the background like a program you never agreed to install. Here is what Stoicism understood about mornings that most modern people have completely missed. The morning is not just the beginning of your day. It is the foundation of your entire psychological architecture for the next 16 hours. Get the foundation right and the structure above it. Your decisions, your relationships, your work, your emotional state has something solid to stand on. Get the foundation wrong and everything built on top of it is unstable from the first hour. Marcus Aurelius began every single morning, including mornings when he commanded armies, managed political crises, and carried the weight of 30 million lives, with a practice so simple it seems almost insultingly modest until you understand what it actually does. He sat in silence and he prepared his mind, not for the day's tasks, for the day's inevitable difficulties. He would remind himself before the day began that he would encounter frustration and ingratitude and conflict and opposition. He would remind himself that people would act badly, that plans would fail, that circumstances would deviate from his intentions. He would remind himself with deliberate clarity that all of this was not only possible but probable, and that none of it had the power to determine his response unless he surrendered that power voluntarily. This practice, which the Stoics called Premeditatio Malorum, the premeditation of adversity, is the most neurologically sophisticated morning practice ever designed. Because what it does is not create pessimism or fear or anxiety. It creates immunity. When you have already imagined the frustration before it arrives, it loses the power of surprise. And surprise, as any neuroscientist will tell you, is the primary amplifier of emotional reactivity. The thing that destabilizes us is almost never as bad as we feared it would be. The thing that destabilizes us is almost always worse than we expected it to be. Remove the expectation of smooth sailing, and suddenly the waves stop feeling like catastrophe. Think about the last time you had a genuinely terrible day, not a hard day. A day that left you feeling hollow and reactive and exhausted. Ask yourself honestly, how much of that damage came from what actually happened, and how much came from the gap between what happened and what you had assumed would happen? That gap, that chasm between the day you imagined and the day you got. That is where most of your suffering was born, and the Stoic morning practice is, at its deepest level, the daily closing of that gap. Not by lowering your standards, not by expecting the worst, by being honest with yourself about the nature of reality before reality has had a chance to catch you unprepared. One practical way to begin this practice is what we might call the morning preparation statement, a brief, honest, written acknowledgement of what today might bring, not a worry list, not an anxiety inventory, a warrior's reconnaissance. 3 sentences, written before you check your phone or speak to anyone or begin the logistics of the day. Today, I will encounter situations outside my control. I will meet them with the response I am choosing now, not with the reaction that would come unbidden if I were unprepared. And I will return to this intention every time I feel it slipping. That is not complicated. It is not time-consuming. It takes less than 2 minutes. And it is the difference between a day that happens to you and a day that you happen to. Aristotle said knowing yourself is the beginning of all wisdom. But self-knowledge is not a passive achievement. It is a daily practice. And the morning is where that practice begins. Remember, the day does not begin when you first encounter the world. It begins when you first encounter yourself. Do not skip that encounter. But here is where most morning routines fail. And this is worth understanding deeply, because it is the reason that most people who attempt morning routines abandon them within 2 weeks. Why they feel guilty about abandoning them, and why that guilt makes the next attempt even harder. Most morning routines are designed around doing more: wake up earlier, meditate, journal, exercise, read, cold shower, plan, visualize, review goals. By the time you have done everything the productivity culture recommends you do, before 7 a.m. you have already spent more willpower than most people deploy in an entire working day, and you have not yet had breakfast. The Stoic morning practice is designed around something completely different. Not doing more, thinking better. Seneca wrote, and this is one of the most practically important sentences in the entire Stoic tradition: retire into yourself as much as you can. Associate with those who are likely to improve you, and admit only those to your company whom you yourself can improve. He was not describing a networking strategy. He was describing the architecture of morning attention. Retire into yourself. Before the world gets access to you, before the notifications and the demands and the voices and the noise, spend time in your own company, not distracted, not consuming, not performing. Just present with yourself, with your values, with the person you are choosing to be today. This is what journaling is actually for in the Stoic tradition. Not to record events, not to process feelings in the way modern therapeutic journaling often does, but to think, to examine, to clarify, to ask the questions that the noise of daily life drowns out. What do I value? Am I living in alignment with what I value? What did I do yesterday that I am proud of? What did I do yesterday that I would do differently? What kind of person do I intend to be today? These are not soft questions. They are the hardest questions a human being can face. And they are the questions that the Stoic morning practice is specifically designed to make you face, before the day gives you the option to avoid them through busyness. Marcus Aurelius did not journal to feel better. He journaled to think more clearly. His meditations, which were never intended to be read by anyone, which were entirely private and entirely honest, read like a man in daily combat with his own weaknesses, his own distractions, his own tendency to drift from his values when the pressure of the world pushed on him. And that honesty, that ruthless, compassionate, daily honesty with himself, is what made him one of the most psychologically sophisticated human beings in recorded history. Think about this. You know what you value. You have probably articulated it to yourself or others at some point. You know what kind of person you want to be. You know what your principles are. But do you check every single morning whether the day you are about to live is actually aligned with those values? Do you begin each day with a deliberate, conscious, honest audit of the gap between who you intend to be and how you have actually been showing up? Most people don't, not because they don't care, because the morning never gives them space to do it, because they have filled the first hour of consciousness with inputs, screens and sounds and other people's agendas, before they have had a single moment with their own. Here's the thing. Your values do not protect you on their own. They protect you only when they are actively and consciously present in your mind, at the moments when they are most likely to be tested. And the morning is when you install them, every single day. One practical approach is what we might call the values audit, a 3-question morning journal practice that takes no more than 5 minutes. Question 1. What is the most important thing I can do today that aligns with who I am trying to become? Question 2. What situation today is most likely to test my principles, and how do I intend to respond? Question 3. What is one thing I am genuinely grateful for right now, before the day has given me anything to be grateful for? These 3 questions, answered honestly in writing every morning, create something that no productivity app and no external accountability system can replicate. They create a private daily conversation between the version of you that exists and the version of you that you are working to become. That conversation is the Stoic morning practice. Everything else, the journaling, the silence, the preparation for adversity, is in service of that conversation. Remember, what you think about in the first 30 minutes of your day is not just mood management. It is identity management. Choose what you think about deliberately, or let the algorithm choose for you. Those are the only options. The body of the Stoic morning and why silence is the most radical choice available to you. Here is something that will sound almost absurdly simple until you try it for 3 consecutive mornings. Spend the first 15 minutes of your day in complete silence. No phone, no music, no podcast, no news, no conversation, no input of any kind, just you, awake, breathing, present. In a world where the average person picks up their phone within 3 minutes of waking, where the first conscious act of the day is an invitation for every external demand and distraction, an algorithmically curated emotional trigger to pour directly into the most receptive and impressionable state of consciousness that exists. 15 minutes of chosen silence is not passive. It is an act of warfare. The Stoics called the early morning the hour of philosophy, not because it was the most convenient time for abstract thinking, because it was the time when the mind, not yet contaminated by the day's inputs, was most capable of genuine reflection, most honest, most clear, most aligned with the deepest layers of the self rather than with the reactive surface that social and professional life requires. Epictetus, who spent the first part of his life as a slave and the rest of it as one of the most influential teachers in the ancient world, taught his students that the most important thing they could do each morning was to remember who they were before the world told them who to be, not who their employer needed them to be, not who their social circle expected them to be, not who their fears and anxieties and unexamined habits had shaped them into being, who they chose to be, at the level of their deepest values and their clearest reasoning. That remembering requires silence, because the noise, both external and internal, is always louder than the truth. And if you never create space for the silence, the truth never gets a turn. Think about what actually happens to your mind between the moment you wake and the moment you check your phone. In that small window, which most people now measure in seconds rather than minutes, your brain is in a uniquely powerful and uniquely vulnerable state. Neurologically, you are transitioning from the theta wave state of light sleep, a state associated with creativity, deep insight, and the processing of unconscious material, into the beta wave state of active cognition. This transition, when allowed to happen naturally and without external interruption, is one of the most fertile, creative, and reflective states available to you. When you pick up your phone in that window, you short-circuit the transition entirely. You bypass the most creative and reflective state your brain will achieve all day and drop directly into reactive processing, responding to other people's agendas before you've had a single moment to establish your own. The Stoic morning silence is not laziness. It is not absence of productivity. It is the deliberate protection of the most neurologically valuable minutes of your day. Here's where this gets practically powerful. Silence in the morning is not about emptying your mind. It is about listening to it, about noticing what arises naturally when you remove the constant override of external stimulation. The thoughts that surface in the morning silence are often the most honest thoughts you will have all day. Thoughts about what genuinely matters, what genuinely concerns you, what genuinely needs attention that the busyness of your life has been drowning out. The Stoics would say that voice, the one that speaks in the morning silence, is the voice of reason, of the ruling faculty they called the hegemonikon, the part of you that can see clearly when the noise is removed. Do not be afraid of what it tells you. One practical technique is what we might call the morning listening practice. Set a timer for 15 minutes. Sit comfortably. Do not try to think about anything in particular. Simply notice what arises, what thoughts come, what concerns surface. What do you notice about how you feel before the day has had a chance to tell you how to feel? Write down whatever comes, not as journaling, as listening, as transcribing what the silence offered. Over days and weeks, this practice reveals patterns in your inner life that are extraordinarily valuable. Recurring concerns that deserve attention, recurring values that deserve expression, recurring tensions between who you are being and who you intend to be. That self-knowledge is worth more than any morning routine that fills your time without filling your awareness. Remember, the world will have plenty to say to you today. Give yourself the first word, in silence, every morning. The Stoic midday pause and the practice most modern people have completely forgotten. Here is something the Stoics practice that no modern productivity system has yet managed to rediscover. They stopped, in the middle of the day, deliberately, briefly, completely. Not to eat lunch, not to check messages, not to switch tasks or review their schedule or catch up on what they had missed. To ask a single question. Am I still the person I was this morning? Seneca described this practice in his letters. The brief midday withdrawal from activity to check the alignment between the day's actions so far and the morning's intentions. Not a lengthy review, not a formal journaling session. A moment, a breath, a question honestly answered. This practice addresses something that the morning preparation alone cannot address. Because here is what happens to your intentions as the day progresses without this check-in. They erode. Not dramatically, not in one catastrophic moment of moral failure. They erode the way coastlines erode, gradually, almost imperceptibly, one small compromise at a time, one reactive response that you had intended to handle with patience, one moment of people-pleasing that you had intended to replace with honest communication, one distraction pursued that you had intended to decline. By themselves, each of these small erosions is nearly invisible. Accumulated across an entire day without examination, they can leave you, by evening, living in almost complete disconnection from the intentions you set at dawn. The midday pause is the Stoic solution to this problem. Not a lengthy intervention, a recalibration. A moment of asking, have I been the person I chose to be this morning? And if not, what small adjustment do I need to make for the rest of the day? Think of it like navigation. A ship that checks its heading once, at the start of a voyage, and then never checks again will arrive somewhere completely different from its intended destination. Not because of any single dramatic deviation, but because of the accumulated effect of small, uncorrected drifts. The midday pause is your navigation check. It does not require you to go back to the beginning. Just to notice where you are, compare it to where you intended to be, and make the small correction that keeps you on course. One practical approach is the midday 60-second review. At whatever point the day reaches its middle, whether that is noon or 1 p.m. or the transition between your morning's work and your afternoons, take 60 seconds. Ask yourself 3 things. What have I done today that I am proud of? What have I done today that I would do differently? What is the single most important thing I can do in the next 4 hours to live in alignment with my values? 60 seconds. 3 questions. Write the answers if you have paper nearby. Think them through if you do not. That practice, repeated daily, creates what the Stoics called consistency of character, the increasingly reliable alignment between who you intend to be and who you actually are across the full duration of a day. Carl Jung said, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate." The midday pause is how you bring the unconscious drift of the morning back into conscious awareness before the drift becomes the direction. Remember, the morning sets the intention, but the midday protects it. Most people only do one, do both. The Stoic evening and the practice Seneca called the daily accounting. Now we arrive at the part of the daily architecture that most people have the clearest intuition about but the least reliable practice of, the evening review. Seneca described it in his letters with a specificity that makes it immediately practical. He wrote, "When the light has been removed and my wife has fallen silent, aware of the habit that's now mine, I examine my entire day and go back over what I've done and said, hiding nothing from myself, passing nothing by. I examine my entire day, hiding nothing from myself, passing nothing by." These are not the words of a man doing a pleasant gratitude exercise before sleep. These are the words of a man conducting a serious, honest, daily audit of his own character. The evening review in the Stoic tradition is the most important practice in the entire system, more important than the morning preparation, more important than the midday pause, because it is the practice that makes both of those more effective, by closing the loop that the morning opened, by distilling the day's experience into wisdom rather than just memory, and by carrying genuine self-knowledge forward into the following morning rather than carrying only the unprocessed residue of the day's events. Here is how it works. You sit, Seneca sat after the light was removed, in the quiet of the evening, and you ask yourself 3 questions that Epictetus attributed to the Stoic practice of daily examination. What did I do wrong today? What did I do well today? What could I have done better? Not what happened to me. What did I do? The focus is entirely on your own actions, your own choices, your own responses, not on external circumstances, on you. This distinction is crucial, and it is the part that makes the Stoic evening review completely unlike modern journaling as most people practice it. Modern journaling for most people is primarily a record of what the day did to them. What happened, how they felt about what happened, what other people did, and how it affected them. The Stoic evening review is a record of what they did to the day, how they chose to respond to what happened, whether those choices reflected their values, where they fell short, where they rose to meet the standard they set for themselves. This is the difference between a diary and an examination of conscience. And it is the difference between accumulating memories and accumulating wisdom. Think about the last week of your life. How much of it do you actually remember? Not in broad strokes, the meetings and the meals and the conversations, but in the specific texture of your own choices. The moments when you were patient and the moments when you were reactive. The interactions where you showed up as your best self and the ones where you were something less. The times you acted from your values and the times you acted from your fears or your ego or your exhaustion. Most people do not remember these things because they never examined them. The day ends, the sleep comes, the next day begins, and the specific experiences that contain the most valuable data about who you are and how you are growing are washed away without ever being processed into something useful. The Stoic evening review stops that loss, not by cataloging everything, by asking the 3 questions that extract the most important signal from the day's noise. Where did I fall short of my own standard? Where did I meet it? And what will I do differently tomorrow? One powerful technique is what we might call the Seneca method, a written evening review that takes no more than 10 minutes and follows a specific structure. First, 1 sentence describing the most difficult moment of today and how you responded. Second, 1 honest assessment of whether that response reflected the person you intend to be. Third, 1 specific adjustment you will make tomorrow. Fourth, 1 thing from today, however small, that you are genuinely grateful for. That is it. 4 sentences, 10 minutes, every evening. But here is what those 4 sentences do over time. They create a record, a living document of your own development, a daily evidence trail of the gap between your intentions and your actions, and of that gap steadily, measurably, provably closing as your practice deepens. Marcus Aurelius's meditations are essentially 2,000 years of that record. They are not polished philosophy. They are not public wisdom. They are private examination, raw, repetitive, honest, and deeply human. The same lessons returning again and again, because he kept failing to fully learn them, kept trying, kept examining, kept adjusting. And yet that record, that honest daily account of a man trying and failing and trying again to live according to his values, has survived 2,000 years and shaped the inner lives of millions of people who will never meet him. Your record will not survive 2,000 years, but it will survive your lifetime. And the person who benefits most from it is not your descendants. It is tomorrow's version of you, who will wake up not with yesterday's unprocessed residue, but with yesterday's distilled wisdom, who will approach the morning practice with the knowledge of who they were yesterday and the clarity of who they intend to be today. That compounding of daily self-knowledge over months and years is among the most powerful forces available to a human being. Aristotle said, "We are what we repeatedly do." Excellence, then, is not an act, but a habit. The evening review is the habit that makes all the other habits more excellent. Remember, the day is not complete until it has been examined, not punished, not celebrated, examined. That examination is the most productive 10 minutes you will spend all day. The night and the Stoic practice of preparing for sleep is an act of sovereignty. Most people end their day the same way they began it, in reaction. The morning began with a screen. The evening ends with one. The morning gave the algorithm the first minutes of consciousness. The evening gives it the last. And what the algorithm serves in those last minutes before sleep is not rest. It is stimulation, comparison, anxiety. The low-grade emotional activation of content designed to keep you watching. Designed by people who know with extraordinary precision what your nervous system responds to, and who have built systems specifically to exploit that knowledge. The result is that most people in the developed world are entering sleep not in the calm, settled, reflective state that produces the deepest and most restorative rest, but in a state of mild agitation, mild comparison-induced dissatisfaction, mild overstimulation of the visual and cognitive systems. And sleep entered in that state is categorically different from sleep entered from a state of genuine calm. The Stoics understood the relationship between the end of the day and the quality of the following morning with extraordinary clarity. Seneca wrote, "Let us see to it that our sleep be not disturbed by worldly thoughts." He understood that the mind does not simply stop when sleep arrives. It continues processing. And what it processes is largely determined by what it was attending to in the hours before sleep. What you put into the mind at the end of the day becomes the material your subconscious works with all night. This is not mystical. It is neuroscience. The brain's memory consolidation processes, which run primarily during sleep, do not work on neutral material. They work on emotionally activated material, on what you were thinking about most intensely in the hours before you slept. Feed your mind conflict and comparison and algorithmic outrage before sleep, and your brain will spend the night consolidating conflict, comparison, and outrage. Feed it reflection, gratitude, and the quiet satisfaction of a day examined and understood. And your brain will spend the night consolidating something very different. The Stoic evening practice is not just about the evening review. It is about the entire final hour of the day, what you put into your mind during that hour, and the quality of consciousness you carry into sleep. Here's the game-changing perspective. The final hour of your day is an investment in tomorrow morning. What you do in that hour determines whether you wake up carrying the mental residue of an unexamined, algorithmically activated evening, or whether you wake up carrying the settled clarity of a day that was lived, examined, and understood. One practical approach is what we might call the Stoic evening protocol, a simple structure for the final hour of the day that requires no special equipment, no specific location, and no more willpower than you currently possess. The first 30 minutes. Complete separation from all screens and digital inputs. Not dimming your phone, not airplane mode, complete separation. In those 30 minutes, read something that nourishes your values rather than agitates your comparison instincts. The Stoics themselves, Marcus Aurelius, Seneca, Epictetus, are ideal for this purpose. Not because you need to study them academically, but because reading minds that are clearly, deeply, consistently oriented toward virtue orients your own mind in the same direction through simple proximity. The second 15 minutes, the evening review as described. 4 sentences, 10 minutes of honest examination. The closing of the day's loop. The final 15 minutes, silence. The same quality of silence you brought to the morning. Not empty. Full. Full of the day's distilled understanding, the evening's reflection, and the quiet anticipation of tomorrow's opportunity to try again. Enter sleep from that place. And notice what waking feels like. Not immediately. Give it a week. Give it 10 days. The difference will not be subtle. Remember, the way you end your day is not a wind down. It is a preparation. For tomorrow's morning, for tomorrow's choices, for tomorrow's version of you, treat it accordingly. The weekly Stoic review and the practice that separates those who grow from those who just age. The daily practices we have explored. The morning preparation, the silence, the midday pause, the evening review, the Stoic final hour, build a daily architecture of remarkable power. But the Stoics understood that wisdom compounds not just daily but weekly. That there is a quality of insight available only to the person who steps back far enough to see the pattern across 7 days that is invisible within any single one. The weekly review in the Stoic tradition is not a productivity audit. It is a character assessment. Not how much did I accomplish this week? How did I live this week? Where was I the person I intend to be, and where was I something less? What patterns emerged in my reactions, my choices, my emotional responses that the individual days did not reveal? Marcus Aurelius returned to the same themes again and again in his meditations. Anger, impatience, the desire for approval, the pull toward comfort over duty. These were not random observations. They were the patterns revealed by sustained self-examination over time. The recurring tendencies that no single day of reflection was enough to fully illuminate. Your weekly review reveals your patterns, and your patterns reveal your character. Not the character you aspire to, the character you are currently building through your daily choices. That revelation is sometimes uncomfortable. It is always valuable. One practical approach is a Sunday evening practice, the weekly Stoic review. Not lengthy, not elaborate. 3 questions answered honestly in writing. What was the dominant theme of my inner life this week? Where was my attention, my emotion, my energy most consistently directed? What was the biggest gap this week between who I intend to be and how I actually showed up? What is the single most important thing I want to do differently next week? 3 questions. 15 minutes. Every Sunday evening before the week begins. Over months, these weekly reviews create something extraordinary. A living portrait of your own development. A record of the patterns you are working to change, the progress you are making, the character you are genuinely building through daily and weekly practice. That portrait is not just personally valuable. It is the foundation of genuine self-knowledge. And self-knowledge, as every great tradition from Socrates to Jung has insisted, is the beginning of everything. Plato said the unexamined life is not worth living. The weekly Stoic review is the most direct and practical implementation of that principle available to a modern person. Remember, you are not just living your weeks. You are building your character through them. The weekly review is how you ensure that building is intentional, the compounding of the Stoic daily practice and what it builds over time. We have now walked through the complete architecture. The morning preparation, closing the gap between expectation and reality before the day begins. The morning silence, protecting the most neurologically valuable minutes of the day. The morning values audit, installing your principles in conscious awareness before the world tests them. The midday pause, recalibrating before the day's drift becomes the day's direction. The evening review, distilling daily experience into lasting wisdom. The Stoic final hour, preparing the mind for sleep as an act of sovereignty. The weekly review, revealing the patterns that daily practice illuminates gradually. And now I want to tell you what this practice builds over time. Not in theory, in the documented, observable, historical evidence of what happened to the people who actually lived it. Marcus Aurelius ruled the most complex political entity in the ancient world for nearly 2 decades. He faced plague, military invasion, political betrayal, the deaths of most of his children, and the relentless pressure of 30 million people's lives depending on his judgment. By every historical account, he remained, not perfect, not emotionless, not untouched by suffering, but consistently, deliberately, recognizably himself. His character held under pressure that would have shattered most human beings. That was not personality. That was practice. Seneca moved between extraordinary wealth and exile, between political power and the constant threat of death under a volatile emperor. He wrote some of the most psychologically sophisticated letters in human history in the final years of his life. Letters that demonstrate a mind of extraordinary clarity and equanimity, despite circumstances of genuine danger. That was not circumstance, that was practice. Epictetus was born enslaved. He was physically crippled by his master. He possessed nothing, not his body, not his freedom, not his future. That could not be taken from him at any moment. And yet he built in the space between stimulus and response an inner life of such completeness, such richness, such unassailable sovereignty that his teachings have outlived every empire that existed during his lifetime. That was not luck. That was practice. And here is what every one of these men had in common that you can replicate starting tomorrow morning. They began each day with intention. They ended each day with examination. They closed the loop between who they aspired to be and who they had actually been. They built day by day, through the accumulated practice of daily self-examination, an inner life so solid, so examined, so genuinely inhabited that external circumstances, however extreme, shake them but could not redefine them. That inner life is available to you, not in one dramatic transformation, not through a single insight or a single practice or a single morning, through the daily architecture, through the morning silence and the morning preparation and the midday pause and the evening review and the Stoic final hour, through the quiet, consistent, unsexy, extraordinarily powerful practice of choosing every day to examine your life rather than simply live it. Think about what this compounds into over a year. 365 morning preparations, 365 evening reviews, 52 weekly character assessments, 365 daily conversations between who you are and who you intend to be. By the end of that year, you will know yourself at a level that most people never achieve in a lifetime. You will have a record of your own development that is more revealing and more useful than any external assessment ever conducted. You will have built habits of attention and reflection and self-examination that run as your default operating system rather than as occasional acts of willpower. And the person who wakes up on the 365th morning of that practice is not the same person who woke on the first. Not because the world changed. Because you did. Because you chose to. Every evening, every day. That is the Stoic daily practice. That is what it builds. That is who it creates. And it begins tomorrow morning with 15 minutes of silence before you check your phone. As we close this journey through the Stoic morning and evening architecture, carry this with you into every day that follows. The routines we have explored are not obligations. They are not rigid that must be followed perfectly or abandoned entirely. They are not another thing to feel guilty about when life gets in the way. They are invitations. daily invitations to be present with yourself before the world demands your presence. To examine your choices before you make them and after you have made them. To close the gap, gradually, imperfectly, persistently, between the person you intend to be and the person you actually are. Embracing this daily architecture will not make every day perfect, but it will make every day meaningful. It will make every day one in which you showed up deliberately rather than accidentally, in which the choices you made were yours, rooted in your values, examined and understood. That is not just a morning routine, that is a life. On the screen you will find a playlist that is a treasure trove of Stoic wisdom, practical tools, and the kind of depth that continues to build long after any single video ends. Click on it. Dive deeper. Continue to sculpt the most deliberate and most authentic version of yourself. Together, let's keep examining. Keep reflecting. Keep building the daily architecture that turns intention into character and character into destiny. Thank you for sharing this time with me. Until we meet again, remember to live not just for the days that pass, but for the life you are building through them. Take care, and I will see you on the next step of our journey.